to introduce Dana Lewis, our next speaker. She built her own DIY, do-it-yourself artificial pancreas, and as if that weren't enough, she helped found then the open source artificial pancreas movement known as OpenAPS, making safe and effective artificial pancreas technology available sooner than it would otherwise have been for people with diabetes around the world. She's now a PI on a big grant funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that's working to scale up patient-led innovation and scientific discovery in more patient communities. So Dana will be talking to you about how she got there and what she's doing to disseminate this kind of work on an even broader scale. So please join me in welcoming Dana Lewis.
Thank you. All right, my green light's on, so hopefully you can hear me. I come from a different perspective in healthcare, just to be perfectly honest. And so I always like, by level setting with people in the room, to kind of understand our shared experience. So if you're here, you probably have a professional interest in healthcare. I know we've heard from medical students, we've heard from teachers, other people who have chosen healthcare as their profession. Think about what you did. You went to school. You chose to be here in this career, in this room. You practiced, you worked, you want to do this. Now imagine what it's like for a patient to be diagnosed with a chronic disease. You have zero choice. I equate it to being diagnosed with, or being struck by lightning when you're diagnosed with something. You have no choice. You have no preparation. You just have to deal with what you are dealt. And you can make the best of it that you can, but you have no choice of how it impacts your health, how other people treat you as a result of that diagnosis. Depending on what you're diagnosed with, you know, it may be something very acute and short. Maybe it's the flu and you get over that and move on. Or maybe it's something like type 1 diabetes. I was diagnosed at the age of 14. I knew instinctively the moment I was diagnosed that my life would be changed forever. And I know diabetes is fairly common. It's pretty prevalent. But people assume that diabetes is easy. It's easy, right? All you have to do if you have type 1 is take insulin and, you know, eat healthy, exercise, all that kind of stuff. How hard can it be? Because we have the drug that treats diabetes. But what most people don't understand is that insulin is not perfect. If you inject insulin right now, if I did right now, it's 10/20, it takes 60 to 90 minutes for that insulin to peak in my body. So it's not an instantaneous miracle drug. It keeps me alive, but it's really hard to get right. And so insulin peaks in, say, 60 to 90 minutes. So let's say in an hour from now, we'll be in the middle of the session heading into lunch. If I did insulin right now, that's what it'd be hitting. But if I had a snack at the coffee break, that food's going to hit my body in 15 minutes. That's quite a mismatch. And that's what makes it so hard, because there's a lot of things that drive blood sugars up. Some things like the carbs in our food, what we're eating, we can measure, we can track. And we can also measure and track to some degree the amount of insulin we put in our body. But understanding how that insulin is impacting in our body over the course of 6 or 7 hours, that's how long the tail of insulin is in most people's bodies. That's really hard to track. And then throw in the things that drive your blood sugar up, like standing on a stage in front of a group of people talking about something. That could be driving my blood sugar up right now. But there's also the impact of, I'm on a 2-hour time zone difference from home. I'm sleep deprived. So that both drives my blood sugar up and down. And when you have all these things that you can't actually track, what do? It's so incredibly hard. And that's why if you ever look at somebody with diabetes blood sugar graphs, either from finger sticks or from a continuous glucose monitor, the line looks like this. It goes up and down. And so if you take nothing else away from what I'm going to say, please understand this. It doesn't matter how educated you are, how long you've had it, privileged or not, where you live, what you do, diabetes is hard. Point blank. And it's also challenging because we do have technology that helps in the case of type 1 diabetes. Some of us are fortunate enough to have access to insulin. That alone is a privilege right now in this country. And other of us have the ability to use an insulin pump, which means that we can constantly infuse insulin in our body throughout the day. That is great. That is the gold standard right now in terms of diabetes treatment. And I'm also fortunate that I have a continuous glucose monitor. There's a sensor on my body that gives me a reading every 5 minutes. What more can I want, right? You know, I don't have to do finger sticks anymore. I'm not doing manual injections. What more as a person with diabetes could I possibly want? Well, these devices are good, but they're far from being perfect. For example, the 2 devices that I happen to use are made by different manufacturers. And if you've ever struggled, I love the picture that Bon showed of a a medical student taking a picture of an x-ray from the EMR to text to somebody, patients have even more hoops to jump in terms of getting access to their own data because my devices are made by medical manufacturer A and B, so of course they don't talk to each other, right? Who in their right mind would imagine that the data from one device would go to the other if they're made by different companies? It just doesn't happen. And not only does the data not go from one place to the other, which puts the burden on me as a person with diabetes to do all the freaking work all the time, but the device design isn't perfect. So with my continuous glucose monitor, it tracks my blood sugar every 5 minutes, but only if my blood sugar crosses one of those lines does it alert me. So if I want to know traditionally what my blood sugar is, I would have to physically pull the device out of my pocket, press the button, wait a second for the screen to light up, clear an alert off, look at the number. Then I have to do some math in my head and decide if I need to do something. I might also have to check my insulin pump and decide what to do. And that can be really frustrating because if you're busy or you're, say, sleeping, and you don't hear the alarm or the alarm doesn't go off in time and it's too late, you're already low or you're high, that can be incredibly frustrating. And that's actually where most of my work has come out of, is the simple frustration of not being able to hear the alarms when they went off because they weren't loud enough. And I want to give you another illustration of how hard it is for patients to get their own data. Most medical devices are designed first for the companies to get the data. Then they're designed for healthcare providers, which is great. Sometimes you need data, but hello, I'm the patient with the lethal drug trying to keep myself alive 24/7, 365. You would think that I would be able to get the data. And I had this idea that, okay, if the medical device companies won't make the alarm louder on the CGM, and they told me it's loud enough for most people, which is not what you want to hear, and I was told that they were working on it, and it would be out in their next version, which was 5 years later. And so I was really frustrated and left with, well, maybe I could do something, but no, I can't. What can I do? I'm a patient. I can't adjust the design of a medical device. And so I was left really, really frustrated. And at the same time that I was dealing with all this frustration of I can't hear my alarm, but I would do something if I could only get my data. Well, remember how I talked about I couldn't get the data from device A to device B? I also couldn't get the data off at all because in 2013, the FDA-approved software for my medical device only worked on a PC. Raise your hand if you have a Mac. Congratulations. If you were like me in 2013, you couldn't get your data either. So when my doctor would ask me, hey, would you bring in 7 days of data? I'd look to look at it to get a picture of what's going on. This is what happened. I would pull the device out of my pocket every night, press the button, wait a second, take a picture with my iPhone, email it to myself, copy and paste it into Excel, print it out, and I hand it to my doctor. And the terrifying thing was he didn't even flinch. He was like, yeah, sure. This is how I'm used to getting data because it is so hard for patients to get their own data off their own devices. That was really frustrating. And again, all along I was thinking, you know, I could design something so much better to actually solve my own problems, but what can I do? I'm just a patient. I can't do any of this, right? And then I finally had the idea of, okay, if we can't change the device, what if we could do something different with additional tools? I can't deal with the physical device, but if I could get my data off, I could use my phone. I know my phone can make really loud, different alarms. I could choose one of those. But wait, if only I could get my data, which I couldn't. And that was really frustrating for the longest time, but something changed. Thanks to social media, at the end of 2013, I saw a tweet from a dad who had a child with type 1 diabetes. And the dad reverse engineered the software for the PC, so not only to pull 30 days of data off the device, but he wrote a script to pull it off every 5 minutes. And so he was able to have his son be at daycare with the device plugged into the computer, and the dad was able to be at work, miles away, watching what was happening. And a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, oh, if I could use his code to get the data off of my device, I could send it to the cloud and down to my phone and make a louder alarm. And this was my first exposure to open source. I come from a communications background. I'm not a programmer. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a designer. I'm just a person with type 1 diabetes. But I reached out to this gentleman, and he was willing to share his code with me, and that absolutely changed my life and has now changed hundreds of people's with diabetes life as a result of that small, simple sharing. Because with his help, I was able to figure out how to get the data off my device. And I realized as an adult, I didn't think I needed remote monitoring, but I decided, you know what? If I don't wake up to my new louder alarm system, I want to be able to alert my loved ones and basically build a smart alarm system where if I don't wake up and do something, it can then wake them up, but that they won't get the normal alert fatigue that I'm dealing with. So we built a cascading smart alarm system, and within the first week, there was a time where my blood sugar dropped low. And even with my really loud, fancy alarm system, I still slept through it because my body was prioritizing staying alive versus like turning my ears on to hear the alarm. And it alerted the person in my network, and they were able to pick up the phone and call me. That woke me up. I drank a juice. Everything was fine. But I immediately saw what a difference it made of having this system and being able to make small changes over time. We started with just displaying the information. You may look at this, and the designers in the room are horrified because it's terrible. But you have to think about the functionality. When it's 3 o'clock in the morning and your blood sugar is low, you need to have the critical pieces of information. What is your blood sugar? What is it going to be? And what action needs to what do you need to do? And so I had very big text that would say, this is your blood sugar. Here's what it's going to be. Take 15 carbs, drink a juice box, basically. And even at 3 a.m. with a low blood sugar, I was able to wake up, get that information, and then also click a button and say, did it, done, don't wake anybody else up. Very, very, very valuable. And we were able to iterate over the time because at first I just wanted to snooze the alarms. But then we realized if I was waking up and pressing a button every time I did something, I might as well tell it exactly what I was doing. So we added different buttons, one for food, one for insulin, and one to just clear everything off and say, shut the heck up. I don't want any more alarms. Very important button. And over time, we actually ended up building an algorithm, which sounds really fancy, but an algorithm is just a set of rules that you teach a computer. If this, then that. If I take this action, snooze the alarms. If I input this data, calculate, here's what's going to happen in the future. And we did. And it turns out, because we had the ability to get the data off the CGM, and because we had built the algorithm that would take data and tell me, here's what's happening, here's what's going to happen in the future, we actually had everything we needed in our pockets to build an artificial pancreas. Because it turns out, through the open source diabetes community, I also found somebody who had figured out how to work with the insulin pump. Again, accessing data from devices is hard. This gentleman spent years figuring out how to read data from the insulin pump. And he also found that you could write to the insulin pump. So if you take the same pump and CGM that I have, and you add a small computer with a radio stick where you can read data from the pump, you can read data from the glucose monitor, use our algorithm to process the data, predict in the future and say, hey, take action. But what if instead of alerting me, making me wake up and take action, why doesn't it just tell the pump more insulin or less insulin? It wasn't that complicated, and that's what an artificial pancreas system is, these small components. And today, this is what my system looks like. You may have noticed this little pancreas on my hip. It's got a red light. It might have caught your attention. And then what you see on the right is a visual of what's happening in the system. The green line is my blood sugar. The purple line in the middle is the prediction of what's going to happen in that screenshot. The blue lines up and down are a visualization of the insulin activity, what the system is doing. You can see the dotted line is what I would be getting, kind of a flat line rate from my insulin pump. And you can see that even though that line is relatively flat, there's a lot of up and down adjustments that the system is doing every 5 minutes in order to keep my blood sugar in target. And this is really effective. So remember that first graph I showed you of the data? What I didn't emphasize is there were tons of highs and lows. There was like up and down and up and down and up and down. Now, the first week after I went on this closed loop system, I woke up every morning and my graphs looked like this. It's night and day. Not only did I get to sleep 10 to 12 hours of glorious, uninterrupted sleep, I felt so much better when I woke up because my blood sugar had miraculously been in range all night long. And this is something that I knew was life-changing for me because my big problem was first, I can't hear the alarms. But that evolved into a very real fear of I lived by myself. And what was going to happen if I didn't hear that alarm and my blood sugar kept going low and low and low? What was going to happen? You can kind of fill in the blank with your imagination. And it got to the point where I was actually terrified of going to sleep at night, which is not healthy. Like, it's not normal to be afraid to go to sleep and not like afraid of monsters under the bed, but am I going to be alive in the morning? That's not really healthy at all. And I knew if I had that fear, if I had had these bad experiences with diabetes, other people probably had those experiences too. And that's why I took my system and turned around and said, we've got to find a way to share this with other people. Now, the FDA frowns upon distributing Class II medical devices, which is what they would consider the system to be. So we said, we can't do that. We don't want to create a company. That's not the right thing. What can we do? Well, we also knew that even if we just said, I did this thing, that other people would go off and try to figure out how to do it. And we had spent a year perfecting our algorithm in the open loop system. And we had also thought a lot about safety and design. So we said, you know what? The right thing to do is share everything that we have, starting with this plain language reference design that describes here's exactly how we design the system, what we built it to do, what we allow it to not do, how we design for failure because we know it's going to fail. And that's where the Open APS movement came out of. It's called the Open Source Artificial Pancreas System because there is code and documentation and design to help other people build the system in a safe way. And so you may be thinking, okay, surely not that many people are using this system, right? That sounds kind of crazy, automating your own insulin delivery. Who does that? Well, the reality is that 3.5 years later, it's not just me. There's over 600 people worldwide. That's a very conservative estimate just on people who filled out a Google form to tell me that they're looping. So my estimate is actually it's probably closer to 1,000 people. But what's really significant about this user community is people had to build this themselves. They had to order off-the-shelf hardware. They had to plug it into their computer, load open source code. This is people like me who are not programmers or engineers or technical people, but they were able to follow the documentation, ask questions of the community, and build this system. And then it's not just press a button and get a pancreas. It's many steps to build it, but then you have to tell it to talk to your pump, talk to your CGM, and you have to choose to use it. And choose to use it day after day. You have to plug it in to keep it charged. If you leave the house, you've got to take it with you so that you stay in range. So people are consciously choosing over and over again to use a system because it was better than living without. And so that's why when I estimate the number of hours our community has with this, it's pretty significant. We have 4 million plus hours with this technology. That number kind of sounds big, but to anchor it for you, the clinical trials of the commercial devices that are going to come to market, most of the pivotal trials have 150,000 hours. Our community has 4 million hours of experience, but traditionally, commercial development, over there. Academic trials, over there. Patients who are DIYing, we're in a totally different universe and nobody wants to talk to us, which I think is absolutely mind-boggling because we have learned so much about what it takes to successfully use this technology. At a basic level, this technology is super simple. Hardware to talk to the pump and the CGM. An algorithm that says if the blood sugar is rising, give more insulin. Now guess for you, if the blood sugar is dropping, do you give more or less insulin? Less, correct. Good job. So you too could be an artificial pancreas system designer. But we knew that other people were going to want to use this system. We also knew that not everybody was going to have my lifestyle and my preferences. So we designed it to be very, very flexible. Technically, you could come in and use kind of our protocol for how the devices talk and build your own algorithm. Most people don't do that. 90% of people are using kind of the algorithm that we put forth to the community. But a lot of people come in and said, you know what, my kid at school, I need to be able to remotely set targets. I want to be able to view it from this device, not that device. So we've made it modular. It doesn't matter if you have a Mac or PC. You can access your data. You can build the system. Apple Watch or a Pebble, doesn't matter. iPhone, Android, doesn't matter. So many people come in and they're so I want to say traumatized by previous medical device design systems where they know it's mostly built for one type of system or the other. And so people are overjoyed when they hear you can use whatever you have. BYOD, come as you are, use what devices you have to interoperate with the system. And we've been able to do a bunch of really cool things like tell Siri, hey, I want to text my pancreas and set a different target because I'm about to be speaking. Or if I want to be really discreet and I'm in a meeting, tap a button on my watch and say, oh yeah, the adrenaline's kicking in. Let me set a lower target to deal with the adrenaline of being on stage. We can be really, really flexible because we can connect my pancreas to the internet. And yes, there's risk around security, but the benefits around this are so high of being able to use my watch or my phone or Alexa or Google Home or whatever it is that you want, display it in your car when you're driving, doesn't matter. We've also been able to design hardware to work. The first graphic I showed you of that system design, it looked pretty big compared to what I'm actually using. That's because when we first started, we were using a Raspberry Pi. And over time, we realized that we could use the Intel Edison, a small chip, which is what I'm wearing on my hip. Well, that's great if you can use off-the-shelf hardware, but that means that you are stuck using what is available on the market. So when Intel announced last year that they were discontinuing the Edison, we got really, really sad. And we're like, okay, we need to find another hardware platform that is going to be available on the market that we can point people to use. And so we've actually gone back to the Raspberry Pi family because that technology has continued to evolve over time. But in addition to just using a radio stick, there was somebody in the community who said, you know what, I hike a lot, and using my phone to log into the rig, sometimes there's problems with that in terms of the Bluetooth connectivity, cellular connectivity, whatever. It would be nice if there was a screen on the rig. And I was like, you know, I don't think I need a screen, but sure, why not? Like for the next round of hardware, let's do a screen. And so that's what's displayed here. The board on the left is what's on my hip, what we call the Edison Explorer board. And then we have the Pi Zero with the Explorer hat. That's the back side of it. And on the right side, I've got that same hat. So it's a pretty small footprint, but on a Pi 3, which is bigger. Important to know that on the screen, you may not be able to see it clearly here, but that's a unicorn. Because if you have a screen, why not put a unicorn on it? And then also for design purposes, I started taking pictures of this rig because it was fairly small with a chapstick. And I say that this rig is about 2 chapsticks big. Well, we have an international community. These are people all over the world engaging in this because diabetes, knows no borders. And people would say, chapstick, what is that? So I had to start saying American chapstick, and I also had to start adding in euros and other things as a measuring stick so people could understand the size of the stuff that we're talking about. And I want to reiterate again that this code and technology is not rocket science. Everything is available online. We've even written the code in a way that if you're not a coder, don't let your brain freak out and go, oh, code, I can't understand that. I promise you, if you can read English or plain language in another language, you would be able to understand this. It says, what have we learned? If blood sugar goes up, more insulin. If blood sugar goes down, less insulin. That's all the code is. And we've been able to become very, very sophisticated in our algorithms, even though they're very simple and written very clearly for a person with diabetes. I've now been able to switch from having to dose my insulin at the time of the meal to not bolusing, not injecting insulin at the time of the meal and allowing the algorithm to pick it up. That is something even a year ago I didn't think was going to be possible. But we've been able to make these small changes over time and really cut away at the key problems that not bolusing is kind of a nice to have. It's not a need to have, but we've been able to add on a lot of nice to haves along with the needs to have. And that's why I get really frustrated and make this face at my screen. Anytime somebody says, well, you're not a designer. What are you doing? You're not a doctor. What do you think you're doing? You're not a programmer. And it's true. We're not traditionally programmers and engineers or anything else. But that doesn't mean we're not designing, we're not engineering, we're not problem solving. And this is so important because diabetes is such a pain in the butt. And so anytime we can do something to remove one of those steps of friction, it's really, really important. And so I hear stories all the time from the community telling me why they chose to do this, why they continue to choose to do it, and surprising outcomes of the way we've designed the system to be so flexible and so supportive of people. One of my favorite quotes is from a mom of a teen with diabetes. They've had two years of diabetes experience. And she said the other day, I don't know if I've ever gone 24 hours before without any mention of something that was related to diabetes to my child. But because they started using some of this DIY closed loop technology, diabetes isn't part of the picture anymore. They don't have to talk about it. The tools and the technology takes care of the diabetes for them. And I think it's really interesting to think how these small design choices that we've made have really added up to be a system that people can customize to fit their own needs. So I just want to close by making a point as we talk about design, and we think about people-centered design, human-centered design, patient-centered design. Let us truly put people at the middle and design for it, but also make sure we don't fall into what I consider the patient syndrome trap. This is a play on the imposter syndrome, where if you're like me, I'm like, I'm not a designer. What am I doing here? Everybody knows way more about design than I do. So that's a very common feeling that we probably know. Well, with the patient syndrome, what happens is we assume patients know a teeny tiny fraction of stuff. And as healthcare professionals, people who work in healthcare, we have all this experience. We know way more, right? Patients know very little, and we know everything they do. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. The reality of the picture is patients know a ton of information. And yes, healthcare providers know a lot, designers know a lot, researchers know a lot, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there is some overlap with patient knowledge. But if you focus solely on that tiny sliver of overlap, you totally lose and forget all of the expertise coming from researchers and designers and providers and patients. And so I'm so glad to hear Matt and Bon and everybody else talking about going out and talking with patients and learning from patients, because we understand the problems that we're facing. And oftentimes we've talked with enough people to understand how this relates to other people's problems. And a lot of times we even have the solutions, if only we could work together. So that is my request to y'all as we close, is to think about the fact that we can together design better healthcare. We can design the future of healthcare, but it's going to be a lot better if we do it together. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great.
Thank you.
So having spent a fair amount of time at IDEO, I had the pleasure of actually working with both the person who makes your monitor and the person who makes your pump.
Yep.
And ostensibly, their rationale for not building the artificial pancreas was that the FDA wouldn't let them. And so I'm kind of curious, clearly you're creating a data set that's incredibly relevant and serves as the basis for what could be a remarkably capable commercial system. What does the FDA have to say about your data?
So it's an interesting story because the FDA said, do not distribute this because that would be illegal. We're like, okay, we won't do that. But there's a unique ability for people to use their right to free speech and the right to self-experiment. So patients can do things off-label, doctors can prescribe things off-label, and people can do that. And so I always emphasize N of 1 times 600 because people are building this thing themselves, which they absolutely have the right to do. And right now, the legislation for the FDA, their jurisdiction comes from the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which says that they regulate commercial activity. Right now, according to the laws of the land, as of today still, they can only regulate commercial activity. They like to put on a front and make it like they're regulating other stuff, but technically there's been no court cases that have proven that to be otherwise. So they say that they're exercising enforcement discretion, but we actually have a really good relationship where we're talking with them about what we've learned, and that's helped expedite the approval of some of the medical devices coming in the diabetes community, which I think is fascinating. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for what we're learning in diabetes to expand to other areas where we have these innovations. We've proven that basic technology is actually safe and effective. And so when a commercial manufacturer, like some of the ones you've worked with, has actually come in with a technology, the FDA can probably review that a lot faster. And then one of my questions back to them is, we have all this real-world data. How can our real-world data, granted with a different system, be used to help expedite the review and approval of some of these devices if we've proved not dead yet, everybody's doing really well, there's been no serious adverse events, but how can that relationship between the real-world data community and the regulators come together a little bit more closely to help speed up the process and figure out, where the FDA really needs to pay attention to versus like overly worrying about patients doing DIY things? Because honestly, I care more about safety than the FDA and anybody else in this room, just to be honest. It's my life. And so we all have the same goal. The companies want to make better products. The FDA wants to keep people safe. I want to keep myself safe. And I also don't want to see anybody, none of my friends die, which, I've seen happen with type 1 diabetes. So we're all on the same page. And I think it's kind of an interesting space that's continuing to evolve over time. But I was actually at a meeting on Monday last week this week. And I was in DC on Monday, actually in the room with the FDA talking about how we've designed for safety that plain language reference design that I talked about. Patients use that as their guide to choose to build the system. They share it with the providers who use it. And I was actually telling the FDA that the FDA and the Big Diabetes Organization need to adopt a design like that, like we have around the safety principles of here's what this technology, if it's going to be interoperable, needs to do in order to keep patients safe. So I think it's kind of a cool space where we're all really figuring it out, but it's exciting because we're all working together. Yeah. Question in the back?
So, yeah, this was fantastic. I'm struck as sort of a relative outsider into this realm that it just seems like it should be so easy, right? Because it's an enormous problem. It's easily commercialized. There's got to be a company who sees dollar signs to say, well, I could market this to all over the world. Your code seems easy. So my question to you is, why, in your experience, why is it just so darn hard? Why have you been hitting nothing but roadblocks to what you're trying to do?
So there are companies working on commercial systems. There's one that was finally approved last year, 3 years after we got started. We intentionally did not go the route of commercialization because we didn't want to create a company because we didn't have that expertise, and we know that the roadblocks to regulation for new companies are very, very high. But also for the existing companies, their processes were designed 20, 50 years ago, and they really haven't evolved to adapt to the speed of software evolution. And that, to me, is the biggest barrier, is they haven't adopted their processes. The company that told me that most people don't have the problem and we're working on the louder alarms, last month, they finally announced a software update that they were going to allow people to customize their alarms. 6 years, a software update, 6 years after I started asking. So I think, to me, I don't care so much about the barriers we face in the patient community because we patients find a way around the barriers and we're gonna DIY it. But the barriers to bringing these technologies to the FDA to get approved and commercialized, I think, are very, very big. But I think it's very much rooted in how these companies are doing it. I think also some of the companies who have been coming from the traditional pump perspective, a lot of them are trying to get into the AP space because they know that is the future of diabetes. Everybody's going to be on AP style technology. But some of them are so late that they're starting to think, is there a way we can use the open source technology to give ourselves a competitive advantage? Could they commercialize a version of the open source stuff? And we say, please do. It's licensed for individuals or companies to use. And we basically have been begging for years, please somebody use this and commercialize it so it can be more broadly available. And we're kind of at the decision point where some companies are evaluating that. And I'm hoping that they will make that choice because I think we have good stuff. It's very basic, and it can certainly compete against the commercialized fancy black box versions. And I think that would also then put the processes in place to allow them to iterate faster, both inside the company and with the open source community as we continue to develop other cool stuff in the future. So I'm excited about this space. Sometimes I sound a little bit cynical, but that's because I've had diabetes for 15 years. So when I look at the big picture of 15 years, I'm like, gosh, this has taken forever. But when you look at the last 3 to 5 years when we've been working in this space, it's actually fairly fast how we're starting to see evolution. And the pressure from the community has put pressure on the companies so that even if their processes are still slow, they know that their next round is going to have to be so much faster to compete with the DIY community. And that's a really cool place to be in, I think.
Fantastic presentation. I did 2 questions. One was with 4 million hours and probably 50 million monitoring events. That's a real treasure trove of data, and we've heard how pattern recognition and AI are what computers do best, way better than we can possibly do.
Yep.
Is there anyone in your open source group that's actually trying to employ those to really, nail down on pinpoint, sugar levels, et cetera?
Yeah.
And then 2, how does the community handle adverse events? With that many people, there's probably been some extreme things. Do you annotate them? Are you able to learn from those, one-off events where sugar spikes or whatever?
Yeah. So first question is about the data. That's actually my day job focus-ish, is how do we make it possible for this real-world data to be used? And so I've actually built a data commons on a platform called Open Humans, where patients can anonymously upload their data to this data commons, and they've authorized me to share it with researchers. So we were doing some of our own research with that pool of data in the community, but we've also made it available for researchers who meet our very simple criteria to come in and say, hey, I want to do machine learning or AI on diabetes. And sometimes they're like, I want to see what I can learn from your community. Other times they're like, I have this idea for this app. I need a data set. Your data is free. Can I use it? So there's a lot of opportunities there, and we're starting to see more and more collaborations there. And potentially that could be used to then fuel further development of our algorithms. It's just a question of time, because this project is 100% volunteer driven. Everybody does it in their free time. Free time is a vague concept. And so the second question about adverse event, that is a term for something that is like a legal term. But in the patient community, when something non-optimal happens, we've designed this to be 100% transparent. So every 5 minutes, the system basically writes down, here's the data I got from the pump and the CGM. Here's what I processed and the output was. Here's what I said to do. And then did the system actually successfully do it or not, or was there radio interference? So when somebody comes in and says, hey, I had this outcome that I'm not sure this should be doing, or I want it to do something better, we say, okay, let's go look at the logs together. And there have been some cases where we're like, you found an edge case where we want the outcome to be different. Let's go in and build that. And so we go in and we do our normal kind of design thinking process of documenting the issue, talking about what the approach is, going and coding it, and then going through our testing process to push a release out to the community if we think it's a problem that everybody needs to update on. So we had several of those, but there's not been any hospitalizations or truly bad things that have come out. The worst thing that's happened has been that the system has solved a lot of human error. Like somebody double dosed their meal. They've come in and they said, why did the system, cause me to go low? And we go, let's go look at the logs. We're like, hey, there's 2 6-unit boluses about 5 minutes apart. Was that intentional? And they're like, no, I didn't bolus twice. And we're like, this is the history on the pump. That you can't alter that history. So let's figure out how you were distracted or what happened when you gave the 6-unit bolus. And it turns out that the system, before the human did, saw that there was a double amount of dosage, started reducing the amount of insulin right away. And so instead of somebody potentially ending up in the hospital, they were able to just eat cookies, and solve their problem. And so kind of the worst outcomes has been people eat cookies. But a lot of that isn't, there have been some errors where the system is given a little bit more than we expected because of a weird situation where they calibrated 100 points off, bad data kind of thing. But we have enough safeguards in there that it prevented it from actually causing more harm. But it's been really interesting to see how human error is still such a cause for issue. And that's why I'm really excited about my no bolus strategy, because even with everything that I know in designing the system, my number one source of lows was after dinner. Because I would walk to dinner, eat, dose my insulin, and walk home. It was really hard to gauge activity and the slow digestion and all the factors that go into that. So when I let the system start ramping up the insulin in response to the blood sugar for the meal, and I walked home, it was more conservative, and I've had a lot less lows. So we've been able to learn more and more things that we can do to take the human decisions out of it, because we humans muff it up way more than a computer ever does. Yeah, thank you.
So it's time for a coffee break. We're running about 10 minutes behind schedule right now. So if you look at your schedules, we're set to start at 11. Let's start at 5.